April 2026. The war has been running for 2 months. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has lost 11 senior commanders, up to 6,000 fighters killed, the supreme leader dead, the nuclear infrastructure destroyed. The world looks at all of this and sees one thing: the power of the Israeli Air Force. American cruise missiles, technological superiority. But there is one question nobody is answering directly. How did 200 Israeli fighter jets pass through Iranian airspace and not one was shot down? How were commanders eliminated with surgical precision? Commanders whose movements were classified state secrets. How did Israel know where they were? At what minute? In which building? The answer did not begin in February 2026. It began much earlier, inside the Corps itself. Because in June 2025, 8 months before the war started, Tehran's air defenses were not destroyed by Israelis. They were destroyed by Iranians. People who had once guarded those very batteries themselves, recruited by Mossad and completing their mission from inside the country. That is what opened the sky above Iran for Israeli fighter jets. And at that same time, the Iranian state outlet Tabnak published something the Corps leadership would have preferred to bury forever. Mossad had made direct contact with more than 100 commanders of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Not with rank-and-file soldiers, with commanders. How many of them accepted Mossad's offer? How did Israel spend 20 years studying the fractures inside Iran's military machine? Why did officers who swore an oath to the revolution choose cooperation with the enemy? And what is happening inside the Corps right now, while the war is still not over? If you want the full story on operations like this one, subscribe and hit the bell. I cover the most interesting intelligence operations in the world. To understand how Mossad found its way inside the most ideologically fortified military institution in the Middle East, you first need to understand what that institution actually was, not what it claimed to be, not what the regime told the Iranian people it was, but what it had quietly, methodically, and deliberately become over the course of 4 decades, long before the first missile of this war ever left its launcher. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps was born in the spring of 1979, in the weeks immediately following the fall of the Shah. The new revolutionary government faced a problem that every revolutionary government faces: an existing military built to serve the old order. The Imperial Iranian Army had been the Shah's instrument. Its officers had been trained in American military academies. Its institutional culture was professional, nationalistic, and largely secular. For Ayatollah Khomeini and his inner circle, it was a structure they could not fully trust. The solution was not to dismantle the old army. It was to build a parallel one alongside it. A force whose loyalty was not to the nation, not to any constitution, but to the revolution itself, and to the supreme leader who embodied it. That force was the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. From the very first day of its existence, it was something fundamentally different from a conventional military organization. Its founding documents described its mission not as national defense, but as the protection of the Islamic Republic and the principles of the revolution. The distinction sounds theological. In practice, it meant something very specific. The Corps answered to one man, and its purpose was to ensure that one man's system of governance survived any challenge, from outside or within. For the first decade of the Islamic Republic, the Corps grew quickly and fought hard. The Iran-Iraq War, which began in September of 1980 and lasted for 8 brutal years, transformed it from a revolutionary militia into a genuine military force. By the time the ceasefire came in 1988, the Corps had its own ground forces, its own navy operating in the Persian Gulf, its own air force, and a newly formed division that would eventually become the most consequential part of the entire organization, the Quds Force. responsible for operations outside Iran's borders, for training and funding the proxy armies that would extend Iranian power across the region for the next 3 decades. But the transformation that made the Corps truly impossible to understand from the outside did not happen on a battlefield. It happened in a boardroom. Through the 1990s and into the 2000s, under the patronage of successive supreme leaders and with the explicit blessing of Khamenei himself, the Corps began to move into the Iranian economy, not quietly and not modestly. By the time the outside world fully grasped what was happening, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps controlled an economic empire that ran through virtually every sector of Iranian commercial life. The construction conglomerate, Khatam al-Anbiya, officially a Corps-affiliated engineering firm, held contracts worth billions of dollars in infrastructure, pipelines, dam construction, and telecommunications. Corps-connected companies operated in oil and gas, in banking, in logistics. A vast network of shadow tankers, tracked by Western analysts for years, had been moving Iranian crude oil through the global market in defiance of international sanctions, generating revenues that went directly into Corps-controlled accounts rather than the national treasury. Reuters, drawing on 6 Iranian and regional sources in its reporting from the early months of 2026, described the resulting entity in precise and deliberate terms. A state within a state. Not a faction inside the government, not a powerful interest group. A parallel, sovereign structure with its own revenue streams, its own chain of command, its own intelligence apparatus, and its own foreign policy, all operating alongside and frequently overriding the formal institutions of the Islamic Republic. By the time the war began, the 3 most senior political leaders of Iran were former members of the Corps. The new commander, Ahmad Vahidi, was present at every high-level meeting and had insisted that all critical leadership positions be filled by Corps loyalists. The institution that had been created in 1979 to protect the revolution had, by 2026, effectively become the revolution. It was the government. It was the economy. It was the military. It was the intelligence service. And it was simultaneously beneath that monolithic exterior, tearing itself apart. Because the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, for all the decades it had spent projecting absolute unity and ideological coherence, was not a monolith. It never had been. And by the spring of 2026, the fault lines that had been building for years had been exposed by the pressure of the war with a clarity that no amount of internal discipline could conceal. 3 factions, 3 completely different visions of what the Corps was for, what the war meant, and what survival actually required. 3 groups of men sharing the same uniform, the same official chain of command, and, as events would make clear, an increasingly limited ability to act as a single coherent force. The first faction was the oldest and the most dangerous in the simplest sense. These were men who genuinely believed. Veterans of the Iran-Iraq War, ideologues who had come of age in the revolutionary moment of 1979, commanders for whom the Corps existed for one purpose and one purpose only: to defend the Islamic Revolution at any cost and by any means. These were not men calculating the odds of military success or weighing the economic consequences of continued conflict. They were men who had decided decades earlier that the revolution was worth dying for, and who fully intended to die for it, if that was what survival required. To negotiate, to compromise, to seek terms from the enemy. These things were not tactical options to be weighed and rejected. They were betrayals, apostasy. For the old guard, the only acceptable outcome of the current war was victory, however that had to be defined, at whatever price. The second faction understood the Corps in entirely different terms. These were the men who had built the economic empire, The construction executives, the logistics operators, the financial architects of the shadow economy that had made the Corps rich enough to function as a sovereign state. For them, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps was not primarily a military organization. It was a business. An extraordinarily profitable, extraordinarily powerful business that happened to wear military uniforms and operate under ideological cover. War was the worst thing that could possibly happen to their interests. Every airstrike that hit Iranian infrastructure was destroying assets they controlled. Every international escalation was closing doors through which their revenues moved. These men did not want the revolution to be betrayed. They wanted it to survive, and they had concluded that it could only survive if the fighting stopped and some form of negotiation began. The technocrats, as analysts had taken to calling them, wanted peace, not for humanitarian reasons, for financial ones. And then there was the third faction, the one that Western analysts had been watching most nervously in the first weeks of the war, the middle layer. The younger officers who had been deliberately empowered by the Corps leadership over the preceding years as a contingency measure, given delegated authority to make tactical decisions independently in the event that the senior command structure was degraded or eliminated. This decentralization had made a certain kind of sense as a resilience strategy. If the top could be cut off, the body would keep moving. But resilience and coherence are not the same thing, and the evidence of what autonomous authority in the hands of the middle layer actually produced had arrived in the very first week of the war, in a single incident that sent a chill through every NATO capital and every intelligence analyst who understood its implications. In the first days of the conflict, a unit acting under the authority of this middle tier of the Corps launched strikes against Turkey, not against Israel, not against American forces, against Turkey, a NATO member state. The strikes were not authorized from the top of the command structure. They were not part of any coordinated strategic plan. They were the independent decision of commanders operating exactly as they had been trained to operate when the chain of command above them went silent. The incident was eventually absorbed into the broader chaos of the war's opening phase, but for those who understood what it meant, the message was impossible to misread. This was not a military making decisions. This was a military decomposing. And Mossad had been watching that decomposition for years, waiting for exactly the moment when the cracks became wide enough to work with. But before the story of how Mossad reached inside the Corps can be told, there is another institution that needs to be understood. Because without it, the full picture of what is now happening inside Iran's military makes no sense at all. An institution that the Corps had spent 4 decades deliberately humiliating, marginalizing, and stripping of resources and respect. An institution whose slow, grinding resentment had been accumulating like pressure behind a sealed door for 25 years. And an institution that, in the spring of 2026, was finally beginning to show what happened when that door started to open. The ارتش, Iran's regular army, was not a rival to the Corps. It was never allowed to be. That was the point. What happened next, inside the barracks of the ارتش, on the front lines, where the two forces were supposed to be fighting the same enemy, and in the quiet calculations of officers who had spent their careers being treated as second-class soldiers in their own country, would give Mossad something it had been building toward for 20 years. A fracture it could finally use. To understand what Mossad found inside Iran's military, and why it found it so easily, you need to go back to a decision made in the spring of 1979. A decision that was not dramatic, not publicized, and not fully understood in its consequences for another 40 years. When the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps was created alongside the existing Iranian armed forces, the revolutionary government made a deliberate architectural choice. The two militaries would coexist. They would not be equal. The Corps would be the ideological vanguard, better funded, better equipped, more trusted, answerable directly to the supreme leader. The regular army, the ارتش, would remain, but it would remain subordinate, marginalized, deliberately kept too weak to threaten the revolution from within, yet large enough to serve as a buffer force when needed. That design held for 4 decades, and it produced, with the slow inevitability of a structure built on unequal foundations, exactly the kind of institutional fracture that intelligence services dream about. The numbers tell the story plainly. In the year 2020, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps operated with a budget of approximately $6.96 billion. The ارتش, Iran's regular army, the force nominally responsible for defending the nation's borders, received $2.73 billion, a ratio of 2.5 to 1, sustained year after year, decade after decade. The Corps got the advanced equipment, the modern communications infrastructure, the reliable supply chains, the medical facilities, the housing for officers' families. The ارتش got what was left. By the time the war began in February 2026, the consequences of that imbalance had moved beyond institutional resentment into something far more operationally dangerous. Iran International, drawing on informed sources in mid-March of 2026, published a detailed account of conditions inside the Artesh's frontline units that read less like a report on a functioning military force and more like a description of institutional collapse in real time. Regular army units suffering significant casualties were being denied medical evacuation by Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps personnel. The refusals were not isolated incidents. They were systematic. Corps units, despite having access to medical facilities and evacuation transport, rejected repeated ارتش requests for assistance, citing shortages of ambulances and blood supplies. The injured soldiers of Iran's regular army, men who had been drafted to fight the same enemy in the same war under the same flag, were left where they fell because the force that controlled the resources had decided they were not worth the effort. The supply situation was, if anything, more stark. Sources described frontline ارتش units operating with 10 rounds of ammunition per soldier. Some units reported receiving 20 bullets for every 2 soldiers, a number so low that it represented not a military capability, but an insult. Field units in multiple areas had no reliable access to drinking water. Food supplies were intermittent. The conditions that soldiers of the regular army were enduring while their Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps counterparts maintained comparatively comfortable rear positions had produced, by the account of multiple sources, something the Iranian military had not seen in decades: group desertions. Not individual soldiers slipping away in the night, groups, units abandoning their assigned positions and walking into nearby towns, seeking shelter among civilian populations, who in many cases were willing to provide it. Because the civilians understood something that the regime's propaganda apparatus was working furiously to obscure. The soldiers of the ارتش were not the oppressors. They were the sons of the same families who had been watching their country being destroyed. The same young men who had been conscripted into a war they had no role in starting, for a regime they had diminishing reason to defend, on behalf of an institution that had spent their entire military careers treating them as an afterthought. The desertion rate among ارتش units in key western border regions had reached 14% in the months leading up to the current escalation, according to intelligence assessments cited in Israeli and Western analytical publications. 14%. In any conventional military, that number would trigger an institutional crisis. In Iran's regular army, it was being managed as a logistical problem, as if the solution to soldiers walking away from the war was simply better record-keeping. But desertion was only the visible symptom. The deeper crisis was ideological, and it had been building for a generation. The ارتش had always understood itself differently from the Corps. The regular army, like regular armies everywhere, carried an institutional identity rooted not in ideology but in nationhood. Its officers thought of themselves as soldiers of Iran, not soldiers of the revolution. The distinction mattered enormously in a system designed to collapse those two things into one. When the Islamic Republic was founded, the expectation, the demand, was that loyalty to the nation and loyalty to the revolution were inseparable. To be Iranian was to support the revolutionary government. To support the revolutionary government was to defer to the supreme leader. The chain was meant to be unbreakable. For the Corps, it largely held. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps had been built from ideological raw material. Men who came to it because they believed, who had been selected and promoted on the basis of demonstrated loyalty to the clerical system, whose careers, families, and financial futures were all tied to the survival of the regime. Breaking that loyalty required something more than military pressure. It required the kind of patient, targeted exploitation of personal vulnerabilities that Mossad had been practicing for years. For the ارتش, the chain had always been weaker. Regular army officers had not necessarily chosen their institution because of ideological commitment. Many had joined because it was a career, because their fathers had served, because the military offered stability in a country where stability was increasingly scarce. They had watched the Corps receive the funding, the equipment, the political protection, and the economic privileges that their own institution was systematically denied. They had watched their wounded soldiers refused medical care. They had watched their units go into the field with 10 rounds of ammunition. The anger was real. The resentment was deep. And intelligence analysts who had been studying the ارتش for years had identified with increasing precision the specific contours of what that anger might eventually produce. In February of 1979, at the moment the Shah's regime was collapsing, the last chairman of the Imperial Iranian Armed Forces Joint Chiefs, General Garabaghi, made a decision that changed the course of Iranian history. He did not order the military to fight for the monarchy. He declared neutrality. The Imperial Iranian Army chose not to fire on the revolution, and without the army's willingness to act, the Pahlavi dynasty ended not because it was militarily defeated, but because the force that might have saved it decided that it was no longer worth saving. Analysts in Washington, Tel Aviv, and London were asking, in the spring of 2026, a version of the same question that had been hovering over Iran's internal politics for months. If the ارتش reached a point where it faced the choice General Garabaghi had faced, between the regime and the nation, which way would it turn? The answer was not certain. It was not predetermined, but the direction of travel was visible in every desertion report, in every account of wounded soldiers left on the roadside by Corps units that had the resources to help and chose not to, in every officer who moved his family closer to the Turkish or Iraqi border as a quiet hedge against a future he was not willing to bet everything on. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps had spent 47 years treating the ارتش as a necessary inconvenience, too useful to dismantle, too untrustworthy to empower. The Corps had built its economic empire, its political dominance, its intelligence apparatus, and its proxy networks on the assumption that the regular army would always remain subordinate. What it had failed to calculate, what every institution built on inequality eventually fails to calculate, was the price of that subordination. Not just in morale or capability, in loyalty. In the fundamental question of whether, when the moment of maximum pressure arrived, the men of the ارتش would choose the uniform or the country. And it was precisely this question, this gap between the Corps and the Army, this 47-year accumulation of institutional grievance that Mossad had been studying, mapping, and preparing to exploit long before the first shot of this war was ever fired. Because there was one more detail in the picture of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps in the spring of 2026 that revealed, more clearly than anything else, just how far the internal fracture had already spread. In March of 2026, the Corps issued a set of internal directives. The content of those directives, which was obtained and reported by intelligence analysts tracking the conflict, contained language that would have been unthinkable in any genuinely unified military institution. The directives threatened severe punishments for any military personnel displaying, and this was the specific phrase used, signs of internal resistance. Not desertion, not defection, not contact with foreign intelligence services. Signs of internal resistance. The Corps was not warning its members against something hypothetical. It was responding to something real. It was threatening punishment for behavior that was already occurring, at a scale significant enough to require a formal directive from the command level. And the men who wrote those directives knew, because they ran the most aggressive internal surveillance apparatus in the region, exactly who was displaying those signs, where they were doing it, and in some cases, who they were doing it with. The directive meant one thing and one thing only. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps already knew that people inside the system were in contact with the enemy. Not one person, not a handful, enough people that the command level had decided a written threat was necessary to slow it down. The question was no longer whether Mossad had penetrated the Corps. The question was how deep the penetration went. And the answer to that question? The full answer, with names and timelines and the specific intelligence that each recruited officer had passed, is the story of what David Barnea had been building since the day he took command of Mossad in the summer of 2021. A machine designed to find exactly the kind of fracture that the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps had spent 4 decades creating inside itself, and to pull it apart from the inside. David Barnea never intended to become a spy. As a young man in the 1980s, he served as a team leader in one of the Israeli military's most elite commando units. After leaving the military, he traveled to New York and earned a master's degree in finance at Pace University, then took a position at an Israeli investment bank. The trajectory pointed entirely away from intelligence work until November of 1995, when a right-wing Israeli extremist shot Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin at a peace rally in Tel Aviv. For Barnea, the assassination was a rupture. Within a year, he had abandoned finance and joined Mossad. What followed was a career that would, over the next 3 decades, make him the most consequential intelligence director in the history of an organization not known for modest ambitions. But understanding what Barnea built, the machine he assembled specifically to penetrate the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps from within, requires understanding how he thought, from the very beginning, about the problem of Iran. When Barnea joined the agency in 1996, he was assigned to the Tzomet division, the unit responsible for recruiting and running foreign agents worldwide. Tzomet is the Hebrew word for junction, and the name captures exactly what the division does. It sits at the intersection between the Israeli intelligence apparatus and the human beings inside hostile countries who are willing, for whatever reason, to work against their own governments. Barnea spent the formative years of his career in that division, learning what motivated people to betray institutions they had sworn to protect, what made them vulnerable to approach, and what kind of offer they could not refuse. He proved to be exceptional at it. Former Mossad senior official David Maidan identified the quality that made him effective: emotional intelligence. Not technical brilliance, not strategic vision, the ability to understand from the inside what another person needed, and to provide it in a way that created loyalty under conditions of extreme risk. By 2013, Barnea was commanding the Tzomet division itself. By 2019, he was the deputy director. And by June of 2021, when he took the top job, he had spent 25 years thinking about a single question. How do you get inside a system that has been specifically designed to keep you out? His answer was not what his predecessors had attempted. It was not a small number of protected Israeli case officers running a handful of carefully cultivated assets. It was something categorically different. And it began with a reform that his own senior colleagues initially resisted. Barnea called it the synergy reform. The concept was straightforward in its logic and radical in its implications. Human intelligence and technological capability were not separate tools to be deployed in sequence. They were a single, integrated system. Artificial intelligence, facial recognition, automated surveillance, cyber penetration of target networks. These were not replacements for human agents. They were force multipliers. They allowed the construction of what Barnia's team came to call a social network map of the Iranian command structure, a mathematical model of who knew whom, who owed favors to whom, whose financial situation had changed recently, whose family members had quietly relocated abroad, whose operational records suggested a growing gap between public loyalty and private calculation. The Somet division was significantly expanded. The decision was made, according to ProPublica's detailed investigation published in August of 2025, to move away from deploying Israeli officers directly inside Iran and toward building a network of Iranian nationals and third-country citizens as the primary operational layer. These were not improvised recruits. They were trained outside Iran, equipped with Israeli-supplied surveillance hardware, given cover identities that had been stress-tested for inconsistencies, and inserted through the 7 land borders that Iran shares with its neighbors. That geographic fact, 7 land borders, was one of the structural advantages that Barnea had identified early and exploited systematically. Iran borders Iraq, Turkey, Azerbaijan, Armenia, Pakistan, Turkmenistan, and Afghanistan. Smuggling is not a marginal activity in that region. It is an economic system. Thousands of people move goods across those borders every day, through routes that have been in use for generations, through networks with their own hierarchies and their own relationships with the intelligence agencies of every bordering country. Mossad had spent years cultivating contacts inside those smuggling networks, and through them, building an infrastructure for moving people and equipment into Iran that was extremely difficult for the Corps' internal security apparatus to detect. Former Mossad officer Oded Elam described the underlying strategic logic in terms that explained why the penetration was possible at the scale outsiders found difficult to believe. Iran, he noted, was not the homogeneous society its government liked to project. Only approximately 40% of its population were ethnic Persians. The remainder were Azerbaijanis, Kurds, Arabs, Baluchis, Turkmens, minority communities with their own languages, their own grievances, and their own histories of tension with the Persian-dominated central government. The surveillance system that the Corps ran was extensive, but it had enormous gaps in the border regions where ethnic minorities had more loyalty to their own networks than to the state, and in the commercial channels that the Corps' economic empire depended on but could not fully control. Those gaps were where Mossad's agents lived. The vulnerabilities that Barnea's division targeted were not random. Financial debt was common. Officers who had borrowed against expected future contracts found themselves in positions of fragility that made them susceptible to approach. Family members living abroad were another consistent vulnerability. Officers whose children or spouses had settled in Europe or North America had something to lose that the revolution could not replace. Ideological disillusionment was a third category. The generation of officers who had joined the Corps in the 1990s and 2000s, who had watched the institution they served become an economic racket, who had seen promotion go to men with political connections rather than professional competence, who had accumulated a private account of grievances against a system they were no longer sure was worth defending. Each of these vulnerabilities was an entry point, and Barnea had built a machine capable of identifying them at scale and converting private disillusionment into operational intelligence. The results were visible long before the war began. In November of 2020, a remote-controlled machine gun assassinated Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, the physicist and Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps general who ran the military dimensions of Iran's nuclear program, on a road outside Tehran. The operation required months of surveillance by non-Israeli agents who had mapped his travel patterns in detail. No Israeli officer was within hundreds of kilometers of the attack. And then, in the early hours of the 13th of June, 2025, the operation that made all subsequent military action possible. At 3 in the morning, a group of roughly 70 commandos took up positions at carefully selected points around Tehran and across Iran. They were not Israelis. They were Iranians, recruited by Mossad, trained outside the country, and inserted through the border networks that Barnia's division had spent years building. Each group had a specific target: an anti-aircraft battery, a radar installation, a communications node in the air defense network. They had the technical knowledge to do it because many of them had previously served in the very units they were now destroying. They knew the layouts, they knew the guard rotations, they knew which systems could be disabled quickly. Over the course of that night, those groups executed their missions. Iran's air defense network, described by Iranian military planners as an impenetrable umbrella over the capital, was stripped open from the inside. By the time Israeli fighter jets crossed into Iranian airspace, the sky above Tehran was not defended. It was clear. But the commandos who destroyed the batteries were only part of the story. The intelligence that told Barnia's planners which batteries to target, in which sequence, at which moment, that came from somewhere else. From assets deeper inside the Corps' own structure than any commando team could reach. ProPublica's investigation described one method in terms that illustrated exactly how far Mossad's penetration had extended. Israeli intelligence had, on at least one occasion, sent a fabricated message through compromised Iranian command channels, a message that summoned senior commanders to what they were told was an urgent security meeting at a specific location. The commanders arrived. They were gathered in one place, and Israeli aircraft already airborne struck the location precisely. This was not a technological feat alone. To send a fabricated order through the Corps' internal command network and have it believed required someone inside that network to have provided the authentication details, the correct formatting, the specific language that would make the message convincing to trained, counterintelligence-aware officers who had been told repeatedly that Mossad was trying to reach them. 11 senior commanders of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps were killed in the first month of the war. Major General Mohammad Pakpour, the Corps' commander-in-chief, Major General Majid Kademi, the head of the Corps' intelligence division, the man specifically responsible for stopping exactly the kind of penetration that had just destroyed him. Each of those 11 men died because someone, at some point, told Mossad where they would be. The question that Iranian intelligence analysts were asking in silence, because asking it loudly meant acknowledging the full scale of what had happened, was not whether there was a source inside the Corps senior enough to access that information. The question was how many there were, and whether any of them were still active. Right now, today, as the Corps attempts to rebuild itself from the ruins of everything it believed made it untouchable. Because if Mossad still has assets operating at that level inside the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, then what is happening in Iran in April of 2026 is not simply a story about a military losing a war. It is a story about an institution discovering, in the worst possible way, that the wall it spent 47 years building around itself had a door in it. A door that someone on the inside had quietly left unlocked. And behind that door, the final question this investigation has been building toward from the very beginning. Not who opened it, but what comes next when the wall finally comes down. By April of 2026, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps was no longer hiding the fact that it was hiding. Senior commanders who had spent their careers projecting invulnerability were now holding their meetings inside a military hospital in Tehran, a facility whose name, Khatam al-Anbiya, shared its roots with a construction conglomerate the Corps had built into $1 billion empire, but whose function now was entirely different. It was a shield, a building full of patients and medical staff whose presence on any target list would generate immediate international condemnation. A hospital employee, speaking to Iran International before the war escalated further, described the atmosphere inside. The arrival of Corps personnel with their protection units had alarmed the medical staff. The corridors that had been designed for patients and doctors were now navigated by armed men whose presence there served a single strategic purpose, making the building untouchable. This was not an improvised response to an unexpected situation. It was a doctrine, the same doctrine that Emily Blount, a former Pentagon official, described publicly as a page taken directly from the Hamas playbook. The Corps that had spent 47 years positioning itself as the ideological guardian of the Islamic Revolution, the force too principled and too powerful to be brought to its knees, was now using the same tactics as the organization it had funded and trained in Gaza, sheltering its commanders behind the civilian population it claimed to protect. Other commanders had dispersed into schools, into sports stadiums, into the kind of civilian infrastructure that made targeting them legally and politically complicated for the coalition conducting airstrikes. The pattern was consistent enough that analysts tracking the conflict had given it a name: institutional dispersal. The Corps was no longer a coherent military structure with a command hierarchy and a chain of authority. It was a collection of frightened men in borrowed buildings, trying to survive long enough to matter. The Basij, the paramilitary militia that the Corps commanded and deployed domestically to suppress dissent, was exhibiting its own form of institutional decomposition. Reports filtered through intelligence channels and opposition networks described Basij members taking extraordinary measures to remove themselves from the operational picture, documenting their own apparent deaths in ways designed to convince their commanders that they were no longer available for service. Not deserting openly, which carried its own dangers, performing a kind of administrative vanishing act, absent enough to avoid punishment, present enough to survive. The reserve mobilization that the Corps had triggered in the weeks following the February strikes had largely failed. Men who received mobilization orders that carried the legal weight of mandatory military service, were treating those orders as exit documents, as cover for moving their families, as the moment to begin the quiet logistics of relocation that some had been planning for months. Officers within the Corps' missile units, traditionally the best resourced and most ideologically reliable segment of the entire organization, were reporting communications equipment failures and shortages of basic supplies. The men who controlled Iran's ballistic missile arsenal, the last strategic deterrent the regime had left, were operating in conditions that would have been unacceptable in peacetime. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps was not simply losing a war, it was losing itself. And through all of this, through the desertions and the dispersal, through the hospital meetings and the fabricated deaths, the ارتش watched. The regular army that had been underfunded, under-equipped, and institutionally humiliated for 4 decades watched the Corps it had resented for a generation, now scrambling to survive, using the same civilian population as a buffer that the ارتش had always been told it existed to protect. The ارتش had its own problems, its own supply shortages, its own wounded soldiers who had been refused medical care by Corps units that could have helped and chose not to. But it had something the Corps was rapidly losing: a relationship with the Iranian civilian population, rooted not in fear, but in something closer to mutual recognition. And that relationship carried a specific weight that every analyst watching the conflict had been tracking carefully, because the ارتش now held the same power that had decided the fate of the Islamic Republic once before. In February of 1979, General Garibaghi declared military neutrality, and the Pahlavi dynasty collapsed within days. The army's refusal to fire was not a military defeat. It was a choice. The ارتش in April of 2026 had not made that choice. Not yet. But the direction of travel was visible in every officer who had moved his family closer to the Turkish or Iraqi border. in every unit that had walked away from its post and into a nearby town. The question was no longer whether the fracture existed. The question was whether it would deepen past the point where the Corps could hold the country together without the Army's cooperation. That answer was not predetermined, but the math behind it was increasingly clear. The Corps could not simultaneously fight an external war and run a full domestic suppression operation against 90 million people without the ارتش. It had the ideology. It had what remained of the economic empire, much of which was being systematically destroyed by airstrikes. It had the besiege, many of whom were performing their own disappearing acts. What it did not have, what it had never had, was the numerical strength to control everything alone. Because the collapse of an institution is not the same as the resolution of the crisis that caused it. The Islamic Republic, despite everything it had absorbed since February 28th, remained a functioning state in the administrative sense. Its bureaucracies were still processing documents. Its local enforcement networks, depleted and demoralized as they were, still maintained a physical presence across the country. And the succession question, who led the system now that Khamenei was dead, had been answered, after a fashion, with the speed that power vacuums in authoritarian systems tend to demand. Within days of the supreme leader's death, the Assembly of Experts had selected Mojtaba Khamenei, the former supreme leader's son, a man who had been powerful behind the scenes for years while remaining largely invisible to the public, as his successor. The selection resolved the constitutional question in the narrowest technical sense. It resolved nothing else. Mojtaba Khamenei assumed the position without the broad clerical standing the role theoretically required, without a genuine consensus among senior religious figures, and in the middle of a war that had destroyed the military and intelligence infrastructure on which any supreme leader's practical authority ultimately depended. He inherited the contradiction that had defined his father's rise and tenure, a system that claimed divine authority but functioned through political power, now stripped of the political power and left with only the claim. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps had been built to be unbreakable. It had been built with redundancies and parallel structures and delegated authorities precisely because its founders understood that external pressure would come, that enemies would try to decapitate it, that the system needed to survive the removal of its leaders. What its founders had not fully accounted for, what no authoritarian institution fully accounts for, was the possibility that the pressure would come from inside, that the men it had recruited, trained, promoted, and entrusted with its most sensitive secrets would, under sufficient pressure, make a different calculation. Not from cowardice, not necessarily from ideology, but from the same basic arithmetic that governs every human institution under stress. The point at which the cost of loyalty exceeds the cost of walking away. Mossad did not break the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps from the outside. What the evidence suggests, the fabricated meeting summons, the recruited commandos who once guarded the batteries they destroyed, the more than 100 commanders who were contacted and whose responses remain officially unaccounted for, is something more precise and more consequential. Mossad found the men inside the Corps for whom that arithmetic had already resolved. It found them methodically, patiently, using a machine built over 2 decades specifically to identify them. And it gave them something to do with the conclusion they had already reached on their own. The wall did not fall because it was blown up from the outside. It fell because enough people on the inside had quietly decided, over years of accumulated grievance and calculation, that it was no longer worth holding up. In April of 2026, the question of what comes next, for the Corps, for the ارتش, for Iran itself, remains genuinely open. Not open in the comfortable sense of a story waiting for its resolution. Open in the more difficult sense of a situation in which the variables are real, the stakes are enormous, and the outcome depends on decisions that have not yet been made. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps built a state within a state. It built it to last, and in doing so, It created exactly the kind of closed, pressurized, inequality-ridden system that intelligence services have understood for a century to be the most fertile ground in the world for the recruitment of human sources. Mossad knew this. It had known it for 20 years, and it waited, with the patience that only institutions with genuinely long memories can sustain, for the moment when the pressure inside the system exceeded the strength of the walls. That moment arrived in February of 2026. The walls came down. What gets built in their place? That is the story that is still being written.